Please welcome to the stage Nine Network President and CEO Jack Galmiche and our featured guest, Ken Burns.
Welcome, Ken.
Thank you. Thank you.
Back to St. Louis. You have been here many times.
Many
with
times.
Us.
Happily.
And Ken was saying earlier that this is your fifth city in 4 days.
Yes.
And is it true that you go home this evening?
No. Yet another city. I won't get home I haven't been home in about 3 weeks. I won't get home for another 3 weeks. This time the promotion is going through the broadcast. The broadcast begins a week from tomorrow. And in this time, we want to try to continue to sustain the momentum of publicity about it. So I'm on the road throughout.
Well, we so appreciate you being with us in St. Louis. You've told the stories of war, Civil War. You've told us the story of World War II and now Vietnam. What is it about war and the stories that you tell that help us understand America?
Well, I think I've tried to pick those wars that are central to a defining sense of who we are. All wars are human nature on steroids. It's us writ large and in a certain intensity, and we tend to think it's only about the bad stuff. But war also produces extraordinary things that are good, that are positive, that are about love, about fellowship. And so the sort of the collision of war sets off very extraordinarily interesting free electrons. And I think that Vietnam is the most important event in American history since the Second World War, and a good deal of where we are right now with the hyper-partisanship, the sense of disunion, the inability for people to talk, to compromise, all of the hallmarks of our genius, had the seeds of that disunion sown during the Civil War. And I don't make films to make comments on the current political situation. My goodness, this has been a more than 10-year effort. We began to do this before Barack Obama even announced that he might run for president against the front runner. So it's in no way our attempt to sort of point arrows at the present. But if you look at it, indeed, if you look at anything we've done, particularly the wars, they always speak to the present. So I could have started this conversation by telling you that I've spent the last 10 years making a film about mass demonstrations taking place all across the United States against the current administration, that there was a White House in disarray, obsessed with leaks, that a president was railing against the press, saying that they were lying, making things up against him, that it was about asymmetrical warfare that the mighty might of the US military had a hard time figuring out how to deal with. It was about big, huge document drops of stolen, hacked, you might say, classified material that made its way to the public's sphere and ended up destabilizing our conventional wisdom, and accusations that a political campaign reached out to a foreign power during a time of a national election to have that foreign power help manipulate that election. You would say, my goodness, you've abandoned history and are talking only about the present moment. But when I began this film, those things were all true of Vietnam, along with hundreds of other things. And history always speaks to the present, and wars just vivify the truths that you can glean out of that.
Past certainly is prologue. 10 years in the making. And when you started this project 10 years ago, and when you started a project, how do you get your arms around such a large subject like Vietnam? Where do you start?
Well, the first thing you do is you wait a respectful distance from the event. You really want to make sure that you are not in any way kind of influenced by the event itself. You want to gain the kind of perspective that the passage of time permits. And in this case, what new scholarship has arrived that has upended almost everyone's conventional wisdom. I could probably ask you all, no test next week, but who the leader of our enemy, North Vietnam, was, and you would say, Ho Chi Minh. Well, by 1959, that's not a typo, he was marginalized on the Politburo and was sharing power with other hardliners who by 1964 had dominant power over the Politburo, and he was really remained a figurehead to his people and the world, but no longer had a controlling vote. So all of a sudden, everything is turned upside down. So the passage of time is important. If we'd begun this 10 years after the fall of Saigon in 1985, in the middle of a recession when Japan was ascendant, people were talking about the Pacific Rim, Vietnam was going to be the symbol of our defeat and decline as a nation, the ball and chain we would forever drag behind us. If we'd waited 20 years till 1995, we're in the middle of the largest peacetime economic expansion in United States history. We're the sole superpower. We've just won the first Gulf War with one arm tied behind our back and a coalition of dozens of the willing. Vietnam would be important, but it wouldn't be the symbol of our defeat. We would have already escaped that. 30 years in 2005, mired in Afghanistan and Iraq, people were beginning to use words like Vietnam and quagmire to describe those things in a now much more anxious post-9/11 world of terrorism. So, as we began that, we realized that what you need to do is get away from the particular mountaintops that may offer a view of it, but not an accurate view. And the scholarship has been extraordinary that has in every aspect reminded us what's going on. We have open relations with the country of Vietnam. They're our allies. While it's unsettled business here and for them, between us there's great exchange, and they gave us unprecedented access not just to the country but to their archives that have never been seen before, and also to their people. And we interviewed, in addition to more than 50 Americans from every walk of life and every sort of occupation, from against the war to very pro-war, and more importantly all the shades in between. We interviewed North Vietnamese soldiers and civilians, and Viet Cong guerrillas, and South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians and protesters and diplomats to give a kind of 360 portrait of what went on.
So one of the reasons we're here this evening is to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Public Broadcasting Act under President Lyndon Johnson that enabled PBS and NPR to come into existence. As I was watching the series, I see Lyndon Johnson in a bit of a different light. And so some of the material that you were able to bring to this documentary series seems like material that we've never seen before, which brings new light to some of the figures of the Vietnam era. So what about that? Where did that come from? How did you discover all that?
Well, you can do a lot in 10 years, and I think we tend to, in this day and age, have a kind of an impatience and a desire to get things out quick and dirty, and then you end up sort of pushing down the street, kicking the can down the street, continuing to accept a superficial conventional wisdom about stuff, and we'd prefer the deep dive. And it's interesting that you brought up the Broadcasting Act, because there's no other place that could have made this film except public broadcasting. Nobody's going to spend the amount of money we had to spend through the courtesy of grants and individuals and foundations and corporations to make this. And nobody would have permitted 10 years to do the kind of research that we wanted to do. It's interesting that as a result of this film, one of the most tragic figures to emerge from the story is Lyndon Johnson, who very much wanted to be the second coming of FDR, who took on all of John Kennedy's foreign policy people, from McNamara and Rusk to Walt Walstow and McGeorge Bundy and others, and said, I need you more than he needed you. And they helped plow him into the war. He's not without culpability there, but he really wanted to focus on his domestic agenda. And because he was not adept at managing the situation or seeing and expressing the doubts that every administration had since Truman, through Eisenhower, Kennedy, and now himself, it got deeper and deeper and deeper into it, and that began to jeopardize that domestic program. So we're now beginning to develop a series on the presidency of LBJ that would focus more on the domestic side of things, and particularly his extraordinary work in civil rights, and hear how the offstage guns get louder and louder and threaten that, the exact opposite of what we've done in this film. But I do want to reiterate that without this thing called public broadcasting, I could not have made any of the 30 or so films I've made in the last 40 years. Not a one. Not a one. I was sitting at a dinner with a friend of mine who is the head of HBO. He's been a dear friend for many, many years. And it was a dinner party with some people who were curious about why HBO didn't do this. And he sort of turned red for a moment, and I said, you know, because, Richard, you wouldn't give me $30 million and let me spend 10 years working on this. And he went, right, you know. And it was very nice because I'd given him an advance copy of the film this summer, and then he's a very busy executive, as you can imagine, and hadn't heard from him for about a month, and he checked in and said, I just finished, it was late at night, texted saying, I'm in tears, this is really great, and I think it's the finest thing that's ever been on television. I said, well, since you're the head of another network, I'm not going to spread this far and wide. He said, that's okay, there's some things that transcend that. Please tell people that the head of HBO thinks this is the best thing that will ever be on television.
Very nice. That's very good. So I always enjoy talking with you about your filmmaking because your approach to filmmaking is unlike any others. You bring us great pictures, you bring us great stories, but you do something with sound that you don't find from many other documentary filmmakers. And what struck me about this series was the music and just the audio in the film itself. When you're making this film, just tell us a little bit about all that, because it's rather extraordinary.
Well, you know, first of all, we care about words, so we are heavily scripted, and we like that. We don't think that the word is the enemy of the picture. In the beginning is the word, as several people in this room could tell us. And we really want to have well-written, literate scripts. Traditionally, documentary filmmakers, you know, have a set research period, 3 weeks, 3 months. They then decide they've learned all they're going to learn, and then they have a writing period, whatever that is. Out of it is produced a script, which is kind of written in stone, and then that informs the editing and the shooting and the editing. Boom, done. Well, we never stop researching, and we never stop writing, and it makes us corrigible to new information as new scholarship might reveal something. And in a 10-year process, you've got to be open to that. And in the case of this thing, you know that the 1960s is such a fertile time for music that we had to have music. So we reached out to Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross of Nine Inch Nails, who had done soundtracks for The Social Network and The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. It is sort of anxiety written, it's tense, it's electronic, it's metallic, and yet through their genius it resolves quite melodically and emotionally. And they produced almost 3 hours of original material for us. We also reached out to Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road Ensemble and gave them Vietnamese love songs and lullabies and folk tunes that everyone would know, north and south. And they played them in their own extraordinary way. But we knew we had to have the soundtrack of the period. A traditional documentary film like ours would be able to afford 12 out of the 120 that we do have. And the reason why we have 120 is we went right away to the Beatles, who have never licensed a bit of music. And we said, we need your music to tell this, and we need you to charge us almost nothing for it. And they said yes. And we went to Bob Dylan, and he said yes. And we went to the Rolling Stones, and they said yes. And we have the greatest soundtrack you could imagine, from Miles Davis and Merle Haggard to all of those, and Simon and Garfunkel and Otis Redding and Marvin Gaye, and it is the soundtrack of the ages, and all of them gave us most favored nation status. The Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young have never released the song Ohio, which was written in the aftermath of Kent State, and we have it. And Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, a notoriously difficult estate, not only said yes, but has actually, you know, sort of publicly talked about how they wish to make an exception in our case. And I'll also add one more thing about the sound, is that most of the footage we get, 98% of it is completely silent. And we had to build sound effects tracks the way feature filmmakers do. So in the case of the Tet Offensive, which you can see in our episode 6, there might be 150, 160 tracks going at any one time to give you the sense of what's going on. And we've done that since the beginning of our work, of my professional life in the Brooklyn Bridge. I had a premiere at the Brooklyn Museum, such as it was, with folding chairs that I set up and an AV table and a projector that I bought with the screen, you know, that you heard your father swear for the first time, trying to get it up with the tripod and stuff. And afterwards, a woman raised her hand and said, "Where did you get the motion pictures of the building of the Brooklyn Bridge?" And I said, "Those are not motion pictures. Those are still photographs, motion pictures. This was built between 1869 and 1883. And she goes, and I said, "Maybe you're thinking of the footage that we did later when Thomas Edison mounted a camera on the trains that used to go over the Brooklyn Bridge in 1899 and 1900, some of the earliest motion pictures that there are in the United States." She goes, No, I mean when they're bringing the big granite blocks by scow to the towers and the men are lifting them up in the hoist." I said, "Ma'am, those are still photographs." And she said, "No, they're not." And I thought, you know what? Just agree, you know?
That's right.
We've won, declare victory. And those were all just still photographs in which we'd added seagulls and the lapping of the water and the shouting of construction workers and hammering and nailing and primitive compressors and hoists lifting up the rocks and shouts and things like that. And she thought it was moving.
That's fabulous. That's fabulous. So many of your films have had stories that relate to us here in Missouri, sometimes specifically here in St. Louis. I recall Prohibition, baseball, Mark Twain, the West, Charles Lindbergh. Can you give us a perspective of Missouri, possibly St. Louis, in kind of the history as you see it and as it unfolds? I know you have a character in this film that we have seen.
We have a couple of characters. Two of our most central character is an American Marine from Independence, and we had a beautiful scene. I was out speaking on an unrelated topic, and someone came up to me and said, "You know, my relative went to Vietnam. I hear you're working on Vietnam." I guess I'd mentioned that as a future project, and afterwards, and said, "You know, he sent reel-to-reel tape recordings back, and our family sent tape recordings to him." And we didn't do letters, we did it that way. And I thought, how ironic, because we had just spent the last few years sifting through thousands of hours of the presidential tapes of Johnson and Nixon that still haven't been fully transcribed. So you are going to have your minds blown when you hear this. Usually the top down is unemotional, doesn't have the tenor of the intimacy of those bottom-up stories of so-called ordinary people. But when you hear Johnson and Nixon and their aides, they're very familiar to many of us, it is stunning. No one will ever record in the White House again. I mean, this is so revealing of so many different things, and most of it we've heard about and we think we understand, but I think when you see them in the context of that. But you'll meet this man named Michael Holmes who lived in southwestern Missouri, sending stuff home to this tiny crossroads of a town, and they gathering around the family's general store, sending out, "This is what we're doing," and the girls I'm chasing, the cars I'm trying to buy, the fish I'm trying to catch, all of this just wonderful quotidian things that speak volumes, and then these dramatic and ordinary commentary that's coming back from Vietnam by him. It's so moving. But throughout in almost every episode is our Marine John Musgrave from Fairmont neighborhood of Independence. And this state is geographically located in the center of our country, but it also is a geography not just of fact, but of geography of kind of hope and of history and of the future. And so it's no wonder we have that arch down there that is down there.
Correct, that's right.
Sorry, just got a little bit twisted. That leads us to the west and our future, and we've always sort of seen that there. This is, a place in which so much of who we are incubated in the world of jazz. Certainly in the Civil War, our Civil War is conspicuous in the history of civil wars for the lack of civilian deaths, except in Missouri and Kansas, in which there's unbelievable wholesale slaughter. I mean, Gettysburg, 2 civilians died. Atlanta, you've watched Gone with the Men, 20, we think, civilians died. I don't want to mention African American slaves because they suffered tremendously, both obviously in slavery, but then also trying to escape slavery and follow a Union army picked off by Confederate snipers. So I just want to set that aside. Vicksburg, whose siege went on, under 20 civilians died. But we think that in the period around the Civil War, 24,000 people were killed in Missouri. So you represent a crucible of all of the issues that our country sort of grapples with, looking forward to the West, looking back to the East, fomenting, being on the cutting line of the central issue in our history of race and slavery. All of those things brings me here to the state, almost every project.
Ken Burns, thank you for helping us
Thank you.
understand history.